Our good friend Antonia Scatton is currently one of the most insightful and eloquent thinkers on framing, as anyone who has subscribed to her recent new Substack knows. And tonight we are really fortunate to have Antonia with us to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision. She's got this down really well. And this decision to take women's rights away is obviously very important. It's one of the biggest crowds we've had so far on an issue topic. And so you will get great fundamental framing information, but I think you'll also hear some great framing guidance that's useful across all issues. This issue turns out to be pretty good for adding those in, and Antonia does a masterful job of it. And rather than listen to some guy yap for the next hour, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Antonia because I think she can run this show really well. So Antonia, it's really great to have you.
All right, thank you, George. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. As I'm sure we're all just sort of banging our heads against the wall and thinking, what in the hell? I wish we were not in this particular situation. And yes, what was sort of a theoretical question just recently is now a real critical and a real critical challenge for us. I mean, this is, oh, I can't even deal with it. So, you know, and my response to things like this is just like, okay, what do we do? What can we do? How can we fix this? So we're going to get right down to it. So the key question about messaging for reproductive rights, or for any issue for that matter, is how do we reframe the debate to get people to see the situation from our perspective, or from our moral perspective? So I'm laying out a framework for a reframing strategy, which is basically, here's the main components. One is, first you have to figure out what your moral position is in this debate. We often skip over that part. Like, what do we actually believe is morally right? Two, we have to create a narrative that describes the situation from our moral perspective, that explains sort of why we believe this is right. And then we have to get that narrative to dominate the public debate. And to do that, you have to do three things. One is you have to only ever talk about the situation from your own moral perspective. B, you have to determine the questions that you want people to argue about in the public debate, because the public debate is always a debate. And then C, you have to use language that gets people to sort of involuntarily associate whatever's going on with our way of looking at it. And that is exactly how the conservative Christian movement took over the abortion debate to begin with. So they created a narrative based on their beliefs that life begins at conception, and therefore abortion is the immoral equivalent of murder. So the core of this narrative is the fetal personhood frame, the claim that a fetus is a living person. And they're trying to create a legal principle that a fetus should have all the rights of a living person starting at conception. So they got their narrative to dominate the public debate by, one, always talking about abortion from the perspective of the fetus, and by never, ever even responding to any claims about the rights of women. Two, determining that the question we should all be arguing about in the public debate is, when does life begin? That question always forces people to think about the situation from the perspective of the fetus. And provoking people into debating that question gives them lots of opportunities to argue their case, to get people to think of the fetus as a living person. And then getting people to involuntarily make associations between fetuses and living people by redefining fetuses as, quote, unborn children, by redefining vague electrical signals as heartbeats, by redefining late-term abortions as partial birth abortions, and by defining their anti-women's rights movement as being pro-life. So all those terms, life, unborn children, heartbeat, partial birth, are designed to trigger the association between fetuses and living persons. So everything they do is designed to trigger an involuntary neurological association between the idea of abortion and the idea that the fetus is a living person, and to provoke us into arguments that gets those triggers repeated in the public debate. So we're going to stop here and take some questions or have a little bit of discussion about this, about kind of understanding what they've been doing. I mean,
Antonia, I do have a question here from Sue Durgans, and I might have to ask Sue to unmute and kind of do a little follow-up on this question. She says she saw a piece today about how dangerous it is to be posting support for reproductive rights on social media. What are your thoughts?
Dangerous in what way?
Yeah, so that's why I need to get more clarification from Sue on that.
Okay, what this woman was saying, and it was like a 3-minute TikTok, was that Meta or Facebook or whomever can gather so much information about you, and they sell that information. And she said, if I were on your page, I could get your home address within 15 minutes, and other people can get it a lot faster than I can. So she said, be careful, those of you that are talking about going camping and being able to take people on camping trips. She said, everybody knows that language, and you're opening yourself up for trouble.
Oh, so I think that's a reference to right, the sort of coded language about offering to people, most people who need to travel to other states to get abortions. So there's a whole I mean, there's nothing, so she's not suggesting that we shouldn't talk about our beliefs and the issues and stuff. She's talking about specifically, I mean, first of all, there's yeah, I don't see how Facebook can give people your street address any more than anything else does. That's a little bit alarmist, but yeah, I don't think anybody thinks that, you know, when they go, oh, camping, if you want to go, I don't think they think, oh, somebody is going to write in my Facebook post, you know, hey, can I come and go camping, and believe that that's anonymous, you know. But I'm actually working with a group of people who are contacting, like, what do you call them? Blockchain programmer types in Silicon Valley to develop anonymous contact, like to develop a system for actually doing all this communication anonymously. Like I wouldn't recommend that anybody who lives in a state where abortion is illegal to go looking to make connections with people on Facebook. Also because it could be a plant, it could be somebody, you know, that you don't know that you can trust. So there are people out there right now working on finding secure and private solutions for people who are actually looking to get out of state. But I think it seems, yeah, I don't think you should have any concerns about actually like engaging in messaging and debating the issue on Facebook.
Get back on the topic.
I don't think that's really what they're talking about.
Thank you.
I mean,
And Antonia, I see a note from Phil here. As you had mentioned that create a narrative that describes our position. Number one, only talk from your position. Number two, determine the questions you want argued about. And then he says, what was the third point?
The third one is use language that gets people to make associations between what's going on and our way of looking at it. So like when they use, when they say, like the whole thing about the heartbeat laws had nothing to do with, oh, what, you know, when does life begin? And it was more about causing you to involuntarily visualize a you know, an embryo practically as a person, you know, to trigger that emotional response. Yeah, I mean, if we don't have too many, I mean, this my description of kind of what they did and how they did it, I think we're all fairly clear on that. So, I mean, if you want, we can just move right ahead to the next.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Stage of the operation. Okay, so
Your values, hide your personal data.
Um, so our message strategy so far, our focus has been to get people to see the situation not from the perspective of the fetus, but from the perspective of the woman. And one thing that it occurred to me at a certain point, we're always saying, oh, but from the perspective of the mother. And then I was like, wait a minute, doesn't just saying the mother actually mean like from the describing the woman from the perspective of the fetus? So we shouldn't even use the word mother. It's woman. So our goal is to stop thinking about the rights of the fetus and start thinking about the rights of the woman. Some of the messaging suggestions that have come up so far include things like bans off our bodies, somebody you know, my body, my abortion, and my decision alone. These phrases attempt to get people to think about the situation from the perspective of the woman. But here's my question. What do they communicate about our moral perspective on abortion? And what is our moral perspective on abortion? So we talk about the right to privacy. We talk about the rights of women to make decisions about their own medical care. We talk about the costs of bearing and raising children, and that people have the right to make choices about when to have children. What we don't talk about enough is the fact that all of the things we're talking about are based on a core fundamental moral belief that all human beings have the right to self-determination, and that an essential element of freedom, and when I say essential, I mean a thing without which you cannot have freedom, is the right to determine what happens within and to your own body. And of course, the term for the legal principle is bodily autonomy. Now, that term is correct, but it's somewhat lacking in visceral impact. There's a lot of phrases we could use like physical liberty or physical freedom. I kind of like bodily sovereignty, as it kind of suggests the idea that we're kings of our own castles, so to speak. So what do we believe about the situation? What is our narrative? And, to start with, I would start with freedom for women. And so we believe that all human beings have a fundamental right to bodily sovereignty. Without sole authority over their own bodies, no person can be free. And therefore, without sole authority over our own bodies, women are not free. Pretty straightforward. And equality for women. Men have absolute bodily autonomy. Women and men are equal members of our society, entitled to equal rights. Therefore, women are neither free nor equal members of our society without sole authority over their own bodies. So using government to force women to endure pregnancy and go through labor against their will is a gross violation of these fundamental rights to freedom and equality. So let's discuss this a little bit. And we could go over some of the current messaging that's out there and talk about sort of why it works or why it doesn't work. So questions?
There's several questions in the chat. One is about the fetal personhood story. Doesn't it conflict with the breath of life and life begins at first breath story common among many cultures, including the biblical account of Adam being brought to life? So just basically saying there's a conflict between the two things. Go ahead, Antonia.
It does, in fact. And the entire debate about fetal personhood and whatnot, many people will point out that there is really no actual biblical support for that. That until fairly recently, that wasn't even necessarily the hardcore position of the Christian church. I know that, in, let me see. Yeah, I know in other religions, that's also the case. But yeah, the whole life begins at conception it's a narrative that, it's not necessarily clearly rooted in the Christian, like it's not actually clearly delineated in the Bible. It's just the story that they're telling.
I have a question about that, a follow-up. This is from me now. So if we actually point that out, which I do hear that a lot. I hear that in various people talking about that. It's not in the Bible, it's not clearly delineated in the Bible. If we start arguing that, are we not then in their frame and we should not be in their frame, right?
The whole question of when does life begin, if you are engaging on that question at all, we are allowing them to determine, to set the agenda of the debate. Yes, you are absolutely correct. They're setting the agenda of the debate. And if we engage in that question, we are continuing to use language that triggers, I mean, even if you talk about the breath of life and all of that stuff, you're thinking about the baby, you're thinking about the infant, you're thinking about the birth. You are not thinking about the mother, what's going on in her life. So yeah, anything having to do with that, just off the table, I would say. Do not engage in that discussion. So can I ask people sort of, what are you hearing people saying out there? What kind of talk are you hearing? What kind of slogans are you hearing? And let's talk about them a bit and sort of whether they're achieving what we need to achieve.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
So National Council of Jewish Women and many female and male rabbis are saying that it's against Judaism because Judaism puts the woman first. And in other words, they would save, in Judaism, you save the life of the mother if she's in danger.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to address that next.
Okay.
Because I do believe that freedom of religion is one of the most powerful arguments that we have to make. But I want to talk a little bit about what people are hearing out there in the way of messaging before we kind of tackle the constitutional questions, which is what we're going to talk about next. So does anybody have thoughts on these ideas of focusing on freedom and bodily autonomy, focusing on equality with men, staying focused on the bodily autonomy issues, as opposed to all of these other things? So what are you hearing from people out there? What slogans are you hearing? I mean, two of the big ones that I'm hearing are somebody you know, which is, the whole somebody you know has had an abortion or may need one. And then the other one we're hearing a lot is the bands off our bodies. Does anybody have any thoughts on those? And I would say if you have your hand up, you can, should we just let people unmute themselves and start talking?
Yeah, Carrie was first. Let's let Carrie.
Okay, hi everybody. I've heard those two phrases too as well. One of the things I'm seeing that people are really stepping into the Christian argument. They're spending a lot of time talking and debating that versus, I've been trying to introduce more economic impact. Like what about people that are working in other industries such as reproductive medicine and people who are working in insurance and scheduling, and what are the legal implications for that? Where will those jobs go? And trying to talk more about the economy, which is largely, hasn't been mentioned yet. Just trying to introduce that to see if I can gain any traction. But really, we're still in that religious debate right now. It'd be great if we could have ideas how to get out of it.
My thinking on that would be that if our mission is to try to get people to see the situation as morally wrong, and to a certain extent, the economic issues, while important, don't actually, I've thought about this in terms of people saying that, there's this whole debate over whether, like one of the arguments that we used to make, or that we've made, is that some people, it's like, I can't afford to have children, and so, we're not supporting all of the stuff that's about we're not supporting people enough, all of those things. You have to stop and ask yourself, would it be morally acceptable to force women to go through pregnancy and have children if we were doing all the financial support stuff on the back end, if we were providing the healthcare, if we were doing all of those things, would it then be okay to have mandatory pregnancy? And the answer is no. So those are legitimate issues in the debate about women's healthcare. They are not actually strategically effective issues in terms of the right to termination. So it is in fact a distraction. And so when Amy Coney Barrett talked, there was part of this in the Supreme Court debate. And one of the arguments that they made was times have changed. Women have a lot more equality in the workplace. It's actually possible for women now to have babies and still go back to work and be successful. Therefore, abortion is not necessary. And so they kind of flipped that argument on us and said, well, because, and even though it's a complete fantasy, obviously, they tried to use that against us in saying, oh, well, it's just not necessary to have women have the right to abortion because you can have it all now. So I think that this whole avenue of debate about the costs and all these things, those are all completely legitimate arguments. However, they're not the argument for the right to terminate a pregnancy, because what we really have to be talking about is the moral, the fact that regardless of all of those things, even if you are rich, even if you can afford to have a nanny, if you can afford to travel out of state to have abortion, it's still not morally acceptable to tell women what they can and cannot do with their own bodies. And so I think all of those issues are distractions from the key argument I think we need to be having.
Philip, what's next?
Yeah.
What about the issue of men's responsibilities, the role of men in this? Half the people that get to vote on this next election are men. They really shouldn't vote on this issue, but that's another sidebar. The question is that a distraction? Is that or is that because in my mind, Republicans only care about their rights. They don't give a care about anybody else's rights. So for us to hammer on women's rights is going to fall on deaf ears on at least half of the men who will vote. Just your perspective on that, please.
I think that the male role in causing pregnancy, all of that stuff, I think also falls under the category of distraction. Simply, not that it's not relevant, but even if men were required to be, from the point of conception, responsible, pay half the cost, take all the legal, if all of those things were true, it still wouldn't be acceptable to force women to go through pregnancy involuntarily. So they are, once again, a kind of a distraction from the core argument that needs to be made. And we'll get into that a little bit more specifically on the issue of appealing to men in a little bit. We're gonna loop around back to that. So should we go to Wendy?
Hi. What I've been seeing from some right-wing people is the idea that the Supreme Court, in making the decision of Roe, was, I don't know what you would say, it was power from out there, and that if the choice, that it's a good thing that the decisions are going to the states because this is our voice now. They're looking at it or trying to convince people that this is giving a choice to the people. They use that, we the people, and so this is better. And I think there are two things or several things from my point of view. One is if you have a woman one of my arguments to them is that if you have a woman who's been told that she has a non-viable fetus or that she's having terrible consequences, why are you going to force her to deal with a government response when this should be between her and her doctor? Also, the whole issue of rape. I mean, the fact that our Republican candidate thinks that there should be no abortion for rape, that is literally forced pregnancy.
Yeah.
That is kind of an easy one to argue, and I assume he's going to back down and say he doesn't really think that.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a couple of actually different questions. One is the question of like, is this the Democratic thing? And the thing is that it's completely hypocritical of the Supreme Court to decide one day that states can't be allowed to make their own decisions based on who's allowed to carry a gun in public. And yet on the next day, say, on a case of a fundamental human right that is protected by the Constitution, that the Supreme Court has no role in securing that right. I listened actually to a podcast is it Ezra Klein, his podcast on, he spoke with Dahlia Lithwick, who's like the Supreme Court expert. And one of the things that they pointed out is that the neutral position is to protect people's rights across the board. It is not a neutral position to allow people's rights to be stripped or not stripped based on local issues. So that's what she said about it. But I think that, if that question is raised, we would go to the point that there are universal human rights that should not be taken away from people regardless. And, the reason that we have these universal human rights is because we've had situations where people in states were willing to take away the rights of chunks of the population in their state. And so the Supreme Court is supposed to protect universal human rights against political agendas. They're not supposed to be the instrument of those political agendas.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of, I'll say, an educated point of view, and that these folks who are from a different, I don't know how I want to say this, but in a different group, have somewhere along the line, and maybe it is literally Republican, they think we're a republic, they think that if things are decided at the local level, that's good, and don't even have an awareness that there should be limits. They're just really poorly taught in school these days.
Well, I would say, rather than engaging in that argument over whether it's democratic or not democratic, the idea is to because we're not trying to figure out what to do given the fact that there are places where the majority of people are opposed to abortion. Our job is to convince people that there shouldn't be anywhere where the majority of people are opposed to abortion rights, because it's morally wrong to be opposed to abortion rights. So that's sort of like a technical, it's a disingenuous issue, that whole sort of, well, it's democratic. Like I wouldn't even get into an argument about states' rights with people. I mean, if you absolutely must,
No, but you asked what people were saying, and that's what I'm hearing.
The reason that we do this on the Supreme Court is because, for a long time we had states that approved of slavery, and, we can't leave it up to states. We have a constitution because the Constitution doesn't allow people to oppress people that are in their own states. But I would try to avoid even getting into that argument and just stay focused on, so maybe say, well, in your state, do people have the right to control what happens to their own bodies? And, if not, why not? Like turn the tables on them and just say, well, do you think that, it's okay in your state for people essentially to not be free? And then let them argue back about that.
Well, then, Antonia, let me break in for a second. One of the things that we talk about is political triage. There are people that it's worth spending time talking to, and in a way that could include everyone if we do this strategically over many, many years. In the moment, though, at this point, we are under absolutely no obligation at all to answer to or to counter what it is that the Republicans are saying. Their methods of communication, to put it, nicely, or propaganda to not put it nicely, is to mislead, obfuscate, confuse, disrupt, distract, and project. And so, and Wendy's right. People are saying that out there. And I'm glad you brought that up, Wendy, because what people are saying, it's important to know what it is. So when you hear it, you know that you don't need to engage with that person. Now, the exception to that would be is if there are, and Antonia, and she brought this up to me this last week, that if you're on, for example, Facebook, or you're at, out having beers or whatever, if there's an audience, then you may have an opportunity. But again, that opportunity is not to debunk or to debate them or try to prove them wrong. The Republican messaging people don't care if they're proven right or wrong. The entire point of the game is to confuse people so much that they don't know what up and down is. And so don't take the bait. And so I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah,
and also that
exactly.
there are great questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in the chat. And so, Antonia, I'm wondering if we have a time to take Larry's question and then move on. And then
let's do
the
that.
questions in the chat, I'm going to scoop them all out, and we'll make sure that if we can't get to them tonight, then maybe Antonia could look through them and answer them, or maybe they are already answered in her Substack blog.
I mean, we do have a couple more things to go through, and so I think that we may tackle some, and we will have time at the end to just take some more open questions. So yeah, Larry, you want to?
Yeah, there is a pretty significant religious issue here. Somebody mentioned that Jews have a different time at which an embryo or whatever is considered a human. So do Hindus, so do Muslims, and so do many Christians. I mean, Catholics seem to be dominating this discussion here. I mean, in the Supreme Court, at least, that it occurs at birth. I'm not a Christian, but I don't think all Christians believe that. And I think it might be, I don't know if there's any Mormons here, but a baby, when they're born into eternal life as a Mormon. And I think if a Mormon, it might be deeply offensive, more deeply offensive to a Mormon than to the rest of us, that someone else is defining the beginning of life as the first embryo or whatever. I think there's a real violation of religious rights here in doing this. And also, it's kind of, as I understand it, and I was tweeting with a woman who's a historian on this, and I was trying to persuade her to write what she was saying in an article. But basically, historically, I think I've seen some other stuff by other people. If you go back 100 years, 200 years, when the Constitution was 200 years when the Constitution was written, abortion wasn't illegal; it was practiced all the time.
Yeah. And
then for Thomas to say this is our original, the way we looked at it in 1780 or so, it's nonsense. It's just not true. So the very premise of this being an established religious idea in our country is ludicrous. And even if it's the majority, we've long since accepted the idea that the minorities of religions have rights. That was a foundation point of this country to have.
We're actually about to talk about that. So can I go ahead and just move on with that? I mean, there's, once again, there is a lot of stuff that we could argue about originalism and stuff like that. But I mean, I think in order to do that, you'd have to assume that the members of the Supreme Court are actually genuine in their beliefs, which I don't think that their belief system is really about the Constitution really being limited to things that were enumerated or existed 200 years ago. I think they just want what they want, and they're using that as an excuse. So I don't think there's any good reason to argue with them about that. So let's go ahead and move on, because we will address the religion issue. So far, so good. We're getting people to think about women's universal rights to bodily autonomy and equality. But now that Roe v. Wade has actually been overturned, we can't stop there. The constitutional right to privacy is in serious jeopardy, if not entirely gone. So we need additional constitutional foundations for reproductive rights. And there are at least three. So starting with the involuntary servitude clause of the 13th Amendment. Does the Constitution include a right to bodily autonomy? I would argue that it does. So, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. I believe that forced or involuntary pregnancy could be considered a form of involuntary medical servitude. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, do men have the right to bodily sovereignty? I mean, I would argue so. I would like to challenge anyone to come up with a legitimate example of a situation in which we make men do things with their bodies against their will. I think, you know, there are some people that would argue that in the military, we do have some things that we make men do, but for the most part, men do seem to have the right to bodily sovereignty. And so the quote is, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So denying women the bodily autonomy granted to men is a violation of our rights to equal protection under the law. And then the establishment of religion and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment. So the United States is a pluralistic society with many religions. In the Jewish faith, life begins at the baby's first breath. In the Islamic faith, there are a number of positions. It varies by sect, but in many cases, the woman is allowed to terminate up to 120 days or even later under certain circumstances. But the principle does exist that it is that the life of the mother is more important than the life of the child. But my thinking would be, in the Hobby Lobby decision in 2014, the Supreme Court recognized opposition to abortion as a protected Christian religious belief. And you can't have it both ways. So, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So anti-abortion laws violate women's freedom of religion in both ways, by establishing one religion's belief into law and by denying her the free exercise of her own religion. So if we want to talk about that a little bit, we can take a few minutes to. So what do you think of those three other constitutional options? And also, why haven't we been using those?
That's a great question.
Do we have any questions in the chat that relate to those? Or
Demi's got his hand raised.
All right, go ahead. Demi?
Yes, that's correct.
I tend to want to avoid the legal stuff because the court has been weighing in on legal stuff, and that is a distraction. I put my favorite billboard idea in the chat: a baby, 10 minutes of his pleasure, 9 months of her body and blood, her gift, her choice. And it brings it back to the idea that pregnancy is the gift of the baby. And that goes along with the idea that life doesn't begin, life is ongoing.
Well, I think that given that we are in a massive legal battle over the right to abortion, and the fact that we are in this position because we have been depending on their constitutional right to privacy, that I think, I mean, if you will notice that in across the board, Republicans appeal to freedom in the public debate about everything. Everything is about freedom. That is because the concept of freedom is possibly the single most powerful tool in terms of things that appeal to Americans on a gut level. It is one of the most powerful things. So I think that talking about, we do actually need to make a constitutional case for the right to terminate an abortion, for the right to bodily autonomy and to freedom of religion. And we don't want people visualizing the pregnancy itself. We don't want people thinking about the flesh and the blood and all of that. We don't want people thinking about that, because that is what activates the oxytocin response that human beings have. Like when you see a baby, you get a response. There's literally a chemical in you that makes you want to care for and protect that baby. Anytime we're talking about that, we are activating that response, and that is not good for what we are trying to achieve. So I think that, we really are in a constitutional battle right now. And I think we need to stay away from the medical frame altogether and really talk about fundamental rights to freedom, to religious freedom, to bodily autonomy, and those particular issues. Greg?
Yeah, I was going to add the Ninth Amendment on enumerated rights retained by people in the pantheon of constitutional support. But the 14th Amendment, I think, is really under attack by the court. And, they want to take things back to not 1950, but 1850. And Dred Scott and the Fugitive Slaves Act. Can you imagine that? And the 14th Amendment is, very dense, and not a lawyer, but there's a lot of shit going on with that 14th Amendment that's important.
Yeah.
It changed everything, and with the way we did things in America post-Civil War. So,
it's tough because, the Equal Protection Clause is pretty clear, but when you talk about, there's a lot of things that come out of the 14th Amendment through interpretation and through precedent and stuff like that. But when you actually read the 14th Amendment, it's very dense. It's not explicit in, in the way it describes, what people's rights are. It's very there is a whole lot of stuff that has been sort of interpreted to mean this and that, but it's not as blunt as, say, involuntary servitude or the free exercise of religion. And I think that for most people, I think the average person understands the concept of equal protection, but very little else in the 14th Amendment. So, and it is because of that sort of interpretation that if we can't rely on precedent in the 14th Amendment, then all bets are off on a whole range of things. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. And so I'm not talking about these necessarily from a legal argument, because I would love to see a bank of lawyers representing the Jewish faith challenging the shit out of this ruling. I would love to see all manner of lawsuits having to do with involuntary medical servitude and religious freedom and equal protection. If we had our own version of, I believe we ought to have our own version of the Federalist Society, where we are working with judges and saying, we will support you and help you with your career if you are very clear in, interpreting this, of agreeing to this interpretation of this of all of these clauses, the way that the conservatives do. That's how they got. I guess what I'm trying to say is we have a tendency to think of constitutional settled law as settled law. And if somebody said, oh, well, we never had this amendment has never given us this right before, therefore we don't have that right. Instead of thinking, well, if we could interpret that clause as giving us that right, we can actually get that right by supporting judges and by supporting people who see that amendment the same way that we do. That's what they did. They have taken over half the judiciary by finding people who see it differently, putting them in the place, and then now they've made it real. They've made those rights real. So what I think we need to do is look at these constitutional questions as in, does it make sense to interpret these constitutional amendments, or to interpret these clauses in these amendments the way we're interpreting them? Can we get people on board with this as an idea and then build the political will behind it that makes it an accurate constitutional argument or an accurate legal argument? So, we have to understand that the interpretation of the Constitution is malleable by political will. And, our job is to not just, I really do believe that the Constitution does, as written, says these things, which in my mind would make banning abortion unconstitutional. I genuinely believe that. I don't think we're stretching that far. I don't think we're stretching very far at all. But I think we're talking about messaging here. And so our mission is to talk to people out there in the world who understand not legally what these clauses believe, but politically what these clauses mean, and morally what these clauses mean, and appeal to them and build that constitutional basis by appealing to people's understanding, but people's perception of the Constitution, as opposed to necessarily the individual words. Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm.
You following what I'm saying there?
And we're at 7:54. We will hang here for sure till 8:30. But if you have another section, maybe let's go on to that. We'll hit some of these other questions.
Okay, I will go straight to that because I think this is really important. So we have narratives that describe our moral perspective, and we have solid arguments about constitutional rights. We already have majority public support, but we don't have a big enough majority to overcome the many ways that our government runs on minority rule. So we're going to need majority public support in a larger number of districts and states, which means that we have to expand our base of support. And what we need is a game-changing public debate strategy. And there are a few examples in our history of truly game-changing reframing strategies. And the example that I always use is marriage equality. The transition from the civil union frame to the right to marry frame moved public opinion by more than 10 points in a very short period of time. And so why was that frame change so successful? Because it universalized the issue. So universalization may be the single most powerful tool in our empathy arsenal. We refocus the debate on universal experiences and universal rights, things that everyone can relate to. We get people to move from feeling sorry for people to empathizing with people. So when we said, you should stand up for gay people, their rights are being violated because they are different, we risked othering the very people we were trying to help, and also we risked triggering compassion fatigue. Instead, by asking people, how would you feel if you couldn't marry the person you love? We were able to compel people to feel that gay people were, quote, just like us, people who just want to marry the person they love. We then emphasized the shared experience with the slogan, love is love. So I'm often asked, well, how do we do that for other issues? Well, let's figure out how do we do that for this issue. And that is, so how can we universalize the abortion debate? So first of all, we stop focusing on abortion itself, because what's at stake here is the right to control your own body in accordance with your own beliefs. This is important because we need to increase our support from men who might find it hard to relate to being pregnant or needing an abortion, and from women who don't believe in getting abortions themselves. So what can everyone relate to? And what question can we ask to get people to empathize? So how would you feel if someone forced you to do things with your body that you didn't want to do? And what language can we use to trigger that framing? So how about the phrase, who owns your body? Personally, I would like to have lots of t-shirts, bumper stickers, and buttons with that on it. Who owns your body could be the gut milk of the reproductive rights debate.
I shouldn't have to take a COVID vaccine.
Yep. Well, that's yeah. So they've already been making this argument for a while. So we could, there could be some strange bedfellows in that. But there's more. So what can people with strong, even conservative Christian beliefs relate to? What question can we get to ask to get them to empathize? How would you feel if we passed laws that forced you to live by other people's religious beliefs? I've seen things that say this in sort of a snarky way, that talk about Sharia law, but it's like, we can do this in a way, if we want to universalize the issue and create empathy, we have to do this in a way that's genuinely asking the question, not just being snarky and critical and accusing them of being hypocritical. We have to genuinely say, how would you feel? How would you feel if you did not have, this is a pluralistic country, we have multiple religions. How would you feel about that? So, what language could we use to trigger that framing? So, how about the phrase, my religion, my decision? I would like some t-shirts and bumper stickers with that on it. My religion, my decision, support reproductive religious freedom. So we can expand our base of support by reframing the abortion debate around universal rights like bodily autonomy and religious freedom. So do we have any questions now about that concept of universalization and how that would work?
Yeah.
There?
One thing, I don't know exactly how to make the argument, but a good number of Republicans have had abortions. I think it's about 20%. In a discussion in a group, I probably wouldn't do this, but of women, ask Republicans if they had an abortion or if they know of anybody who did. That's pretty empathetic if they have to answer that question, because it's definitely not just liberals at all that have abortions. There was another part of that. Oh, kind of a nastier streak on that is there's been a Twitter string out today asking the question, outing Republican men, mostly politicians, but other people too, who have been responsible for their abortions. I'm not sure, that's kind of a weaponized version. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think Democrats need to be nice here, or at least pro-life people need to be nice about this. But the fact is, there's a lot of prominent Republicans and conservatives who have been responsible, men who've been responsible for abortion. And when they're passing laws like this, they should be called out on it. The only exception I would make is that it should never involve an underage woman, calling out an underage woman that was impregnated by an older man. But other than that, it's fair game, I believe.
Well, so is the purpose of that communication to compel empathy or to accuse people of being hypocrites? Is to just say, well, you're wrong, you don't believe what you're saying.
Two different conversations with different purposes.
Maybe if I could jump in.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry, Larry, go ahead. No,
you go.
Jinx. Sometimes what I say on that is that there are different messengers out there. So whoever it was that outed those persons, that's great. That's what they're doing. Our purpose, because all of us here do voter contact. We're talking to real people about things. You're all leaders, or you wouldn't be here. And when we're doing it, the kind of messaging that we do in the moment with people should be about people and should be along the lines that Antonia is talking about. And it's just fine if some other people are doing that. But what we do a lot is we do, maybe you might call it demsplaining, and we just want to show where they're wrong. We want to show where they're hypocritical. There are people that are doing that, but when we're doing that, we're generally in their frames. And so we're not getting the bang for our buck when we're doing it. It's not completely useless, but it's not as effective as staying in the frames that we really need to stay in to do that. So, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, Larry, and maybe, we need to encourage those people who do that. Go ahead and do that. If you're a news person and you're finding this out, hey, there's another bit of information. That's great, and we go on. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that, like, if you're asking people, like, rather than saying, have you had an abortion, which is in a way just saying, are you a hypocrite? You would say, I understand that many people in conservative communities still go ahead and have them. Why do you think that is? What do you think? What do you think is causing people who were raised with a certain set of religious go ahead and do it anyway? What do you think is, the reasoning behind that? What do you think is happening with them? And then it forces them, because then instead of saying, well, I had one and I don't really feel like admitting that or explaining why, then they could say, well, I don't know, maybe some people find themselves, then you're getting them to think about it. But rather than say it in a way that's just about outing them as a hypocrite, you get them to, because our goal here is, whatever's happening in the debate, is to use it as an opportunity to get you're not really talking, your goal isn't to convince the person you're talking to, the goal is to convince the person who's watching you talk to that person. Because the person you're talking to is generally coming from a place where they already have a position, they're already engaged in that. And it's not to get them to admit they're wrong or to back down or even necessarily change their mind, because for the most part, the people we're debating about in public are already on it, have an agenda, and are in, they're not persuadables per se. So the idea is, we're having a debate with this person and there's 10 people over there watching, and those are the people we're going to convince. So the idea is, whatever they're talking about, how do we use that as an opportunity to bring up the idea that the right to control your own body is essential to freedom, and that you cannot be free without that right? How do you use that to bring up the fact that we live in a religiously diverse society, and that not everybody, that we need to have laws that allow everybody to live by their own religion? And so if you're not doing whatever, if you can use that conversation as a way to bring up one of those things, great. If not, you're not actually producing the results and getting that influence on those 10 viewers, the jury in the court of public opinion, so to speak. Then you're not achieving the framing mission that we're trying to achieve.
One of the things you brought up, Antonia, in your article was the power of asking questions, and that what that does. You had mentioned that you in effect, rather than us trying to convince people that the other guy's wrong, you're asking a question that forces the other guy to answer our questions, which puts them in our frame. And along with that, and it'd be great if you could talk on it a bit, is the notion of creating controversy. And so, of course, the Republicans create controversy out of everything, because people love to watch controversy, any kind of conflict. I mean, look at TV, it's all, cops or whatever. And but if we're the ones creating the controversy, that flips the tables. They have to answer, and that lets us set the agenda. I don't know if you want to comment a bit on that.
I could, yeah, that's actually a really, really important question. And I think that, when we're working on sort of we know what our moral position is, we've articulated that. How do we get that to be out there in the public debate? And, obviously the first thing is
Peeling the shrimp and putting water for,
bringing up that issue. So, but the two things that we need to do, one is, what is the question that people could, it's always going to be a debate. So if you say something that is hands down, nobody could disagree with it, it's not going to be in the public debate, because you have to say things in ways that get people to fight back, because then you are getting exposure in the public debate. And that's one thing that we forget about a lot, is that when people are disagreeing with us, it's not hurting us. It's actually an opportunity for us to make our case. And it's a way to get our issue to get airtime in the public debate. So, so if we talk about things like, if we want to make the public debate about bodily autonomy, we ask questions like, well, can you think of an example where government can force people to do things with their bodies against their will? Like, name one, come up with anything. Because I can't. I mean, as people say, so sometimes you hear people say, like, we don't even donate organs from dead bodies without their permission. And so one of the things we do is, yeah, we say that, but what we have to do is connect the dots between that and saying, we don't even allow people to, we don't even take organs from dead bodies without their permission, because in this society, we believe in bodily autonomy. We believe that you have the right to control what happens to your body, even after you're dead, and so we can't just say the thing, we have to point out what that thing is meaning and what that is expressing, and we have to be explicit about that. So one of the things that I would say is, like, could the government commandeer your kidney to save the life of a person who is actually already alive? Like pose that question. I mean, one could argue that having one of your kidneys removed is less invasive than 9 months of pregnancy, but we would never dream of saying, hey man, we're here from the government, we're taking your kidney. Not in a million years, we wouldn't do that. So that's a good way to raise that question. Like, when do we do that? Could we require people to give blood? Could we force people to? Of course not, But also, I would say, I love the question of, does forced pregnancy can constitute involuntary medical servitude? Like, let's have that discussion. And, for example, like, there's the difference between medical, like, involuntary servitude and slavery. So we use the term slavery as in, like, whole ownership. Involuntary servitude is like, I'm doing some forced to do some work. But what if we called it medical slavery? Like, we could actually, if we couldn't get conservatives to take the bait and argue with us about that, we could probably argue with ourselves about that. Like, half of us could say it is medical slavery, and half of us would say, well, no, it's involuntary servitude, but it doesn't actually qualify as slavery. And then we could spend all day talking about what is the difference between slavery and voluntary servitude, and whether and we could argue about that for months without even the conservatives bothering to pitch in and argue their side of the story. Like, we don't even need them to take the bait. We can split up and take both sides of the issue, and we'd still be succeeding in, having this debate about whether forced pregnancy is slavery or involuntary servitude, both of which are outlawed by the 13th Amendment.
And Tonya, what I'm seeing in the chat, and it's popping up periodically, is about this whole idea of bodily autonomy. And Phil had said earlier, and it came up again, about vaccines, about drafting men into the military. Another one came up about end of life decisions. How do these two things kind of work from a messaging standpoint?
Well, I would say that one of the things that we should say is we lost the battle on vaccines, because under no circumstances, even to stop a deadly plague from ravishing our country, we believe in bodily autonomy so strongly that in no case did we actually force anyone to get a vaccine. There were situations where if you didn't get a vaccine, you'd have to wear a mask. There were situations where if you didn't get a vaccine, you couldn't go into a certain area and expose people. There were situations where if you didn't get a vaccine, you could get a test instead. But under no circumstances did we ever actually force anyone to get a vaccine, because that is how strongly we believe in bodily autonomy in this country. You know,
That's a good point, Antonia. And I remember saying to people when they would come, when they'd say that, it's like nobody is holding you down and putting a needle in your arm. You have a choice. You might not like your choices, but you have a choice.
Right. I mean, point out to people that something as tiny as getting vaccinated, that we had a huge percentage of people in our population that actually said, I'm not going to do that, even to prevent, you know, in a situation where, you know, thousands, if not millions of people could die. And even in that situation, we did not force anyone to do that because we believe in bodily autonomy. And that's a perfect example of a situation where, how is it that something like pregnancy, which is about, it is the definition of invasive. It takes over your whole freaking body, you know, emotionally, chemically, physically. I mean, it's the most invasive thing you can do to a body. And yet we don't seem to have any problem forcing that on women, while, you know, that's a good argument for the equality argument, is that we would never dream, there's no situation with men. And the only thing I can think of is, like, if you are in the Army, one of the things that you agree to do is allow certain types of medical experimentation. And even then, I think there's some very heavy restrictions on that. But in that case, people voluntarily. I mean, we haven't had an actual draft in this country since when? And I don't think we ever will again. I don't think this country would accept an actual, you know, forced conscription. I can't see that. Personally, I don't see that ever really happening again. You know, if we don't have a situation where there's enough public will for people to voluntarily join the Army to fight whatever it is that we're fighting, then it's not going to happen. So I would argue that, you know, the draft is kind of like, you know, we may as well just admit that that's not a real thing anymore, because we don't really do that. And if you talk about medical testing, oh my God, the restrictions and, you know, safeguards about medical testing are so dramatic. Like, you know, and even labeling, like, we don't, you know, you're not allowed you're not just allowed to sell a food product or a drug without clearly labeling exactly what's in it, because that's how much respect we have over people's right to do what they want with their own bodies. So all of those cases, I think, are supportive to our case when it comes to bodily autonomy. So yeah, those are great arguments to have, because they, you know, by posing those questions like you just posed to me, you gave me an opportunity to elaborate on our society's belief of bodily autonomy.
Enrico?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm really enjoying the great ideas, Antonia. You know, I see, you know, our tendency tends to go toward the facts, right? And you know, I think about stop, drop, and roll, that you know, and how difficult it is in these days when Republicans are just so, you know, there's so many inconsistencies, even in the Supreme Court decisions, and this level of hypocrisy is through the roof. But I just you know, but I love what you said, to basically give priority to right versus wrong, and it's this fundamental right to freedom, and prioritizing that, you know, and then going into a constitutional or you know, other things. But yeah, I love that. Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you. I mean, you will notice that in the vaccine debate, they went straight for freedom. They didn't engage in arguments over, like, is this really necessary to stem the spread of the disease? Or they didn't even talk about any of those things. They never responded to any of the arguments. They just went straight to my body. You can't make me do things with my body that I don't want to do. End of story. And that's one of the reasons they're successful, is they don't get caught up in engaging in debates over things that aren't what they're trying to get out there. So yeah, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, listening to all of this, as a person who went to Catholic school, K through 12, in high school, they had groomed us to go and do protests at Planned Parenthood. They
Really?
showed kinds of
Wow.
graphic videos. And just to let you know, every day in school, we had religion class and they teach you how to argue, right? They teach you how to debate. So as I'm hearing all the things we're talking about, automatically all these years later, I'm thinking, this is what they would say. This is what they'd say. This is how I can argue it. This is see how this plays out. And I think that our conversation was super helpful tonight, but just, I want to tell everybody that engaging in these conversations with particular people, they're going to come right back at you. So try to carry the conversation through yourself ahead of time alone, and have like this argument going on and what you would say, because they certainly know how to do it. And just kind of just sharing, that's all.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I actually, the first time I really realized how powerful the religious freedom argument could be was I was going to visit my brother in Texas. And I stayed in an Airbnb because he was moving or something. He was in the process of moving or something. And I stayed with a family, and I do this a lot of time. Like I travel constantly, and I like to stay in Airbnbs where I just have a room in someone's house. And then I end up in these crazy conversations with random normal people. So the people that I ended up staying with were a very conservative Christian family. And somehow we started talking about abortion over breakfast. And, and I asked themselves, I said, look, so, your belief in, your opposition to abortion, I mean, that's a religious belief, right? Like, why do you believe this so strongly? And they're like, well, because God says, that this is wrong. And I was like, so that's a religious belief that's grounded in your religion. They're like, absolutely. It's absolutely a religious belief. And then I said, well, I mean, you do recognize that you live in a society that has a lot of different religions in it, that there's a lot of different people that believe. And they were like, yeah, of course. And I said, well, how would you feel if people from one of those other religions, tried to pass a law that made you live by their religious beliefs? And they would say, oh, well, we wouldn't, that would be terrible. And I said, well, I mean, one of the reasons why I am pro-choice is because laws that what we call pro-choice laws are actually religious freedom laws. With a pro-choice law, I get to practice my religion, you get to practice your religion. But what these these laws that people are trying to pass are doing is they're essentially saying that you want me to live by your religion. And they were really like, I didn't budge them 1 inch on whether it was okay to have an abortion. I did budge them on whether it was right to use the government to impose their religious beliefs on others. Because I got them to think about, how they would feel if we passed laws that required them, to live by somebody else's beliefs. And they had never thought about pro-choice, not as being pro-abortion, but as being everybody gets to practice their own religion. So I mean, in your Carrie, do you feel like in your, I mean, I also went to Catholic school, but up till high school, and kind of a flaming liberal one at that. But that argument seemed to work on people who were pretty darn Christian conservative.
So as I'm thinking about this right now, I can just tell you, my background was very conservative, and they say, but Catholicism is the one true religion, right? Right. Everyone else is wrong. I'm just saying that was the mindset.
Yeah.
And don't really get into the whole come to Jesus and choice kind of thing. You're baptized when you're a baby, and I'm like thinking that is where it is different with some evangelical Christians, where they're like, you have to choose as an adult, and everybody has the right to freedom of choice. And that's a central tenet of their Christian belief. And so like they would just argue and say, we're the one true religion, we're right. Basically, if we just pray hard enough, right, this is going to happen, and we're going to push this through, and eventually people will see. And we're doing, it's like a religion war on it, and they believe they're winning.
Well, if you do not believe in freedom of religion, then that argument doesn't work on you. And guess what? We're never going to get that person. So don't even worry about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
I
Let me
one of
bring
the
up something here about
of framing is that you're trying to reach persuadables. You have to recognize that there's this chunk of people on both sides. It's like a jury. Like when you go through jury selection, they use these questionnaires to weed people out who have pre-decided it's the case, right? So when you're looking at the public debate, there are a certain segment of people who, if this was a jury selection, those people would have been weeded out because they are not open to hearing the other point of view. Like a persuadable person is somebody who is capable of hearing and understanding and considering another point of view, even if they disagree with it. So just remember that our job is to find and reach those persuadables, not to waste our time arguing with people who are absolutely opposed. But if you're having an argument with one of those people who's opposed, do it in such a way that the people on the side watching are going to get the message delivered to them.
Then here's something that I've discovered too. I've mentioned this a few times in past webinars, but Carrie, when you're talking about how this kind of messaging training is drilled into kids and all that, one interesting thing about it is it tends to be very consistent in that the methods are the same, the arguments are the same, and what happens is I think that people who are trained that way get a certain amount of confidence in what they're saying, but it never occurs to them that there's really another way to think about it. And when you have that audience that Antonia talks about, when you and I know, Carrie, you've heard me say this, that when you offer this other viewpoint, like Antonia did with saying, well, I know this is a religious thing for you, but you're in a country with different religions, so it's a different thing you're trying to take away. When you do that, when you challenge some of these things, it's amazing how many times you'll hear people, even on the far right, say they get a quizzical look in their eye and they go, I've never thought of it that way, which I consider to be a win in a lot of ways. And anytime we can, and especially the audience watching, but if we offer that alternative viewpoint, something they've never thought about, we've planted a seed. And strategic messaging is really a lot about planting those seeds, because when you do, you're literally building different neural connections in people's brains. And if we're all doing that, then people will eventually come back to the way we think, because most of the country used to think like us for quite a while. So.
And even then, yeah. So say you're talking to somebody and you suggest that, and they've never heard it before, and they're like, nope, I don't even agree. But then later on, they see a Facebook post by a Jewish person saying, somebody's forcing me to live by their religion. Right. Like over time, each time that happens, a neurological connection is made between this issue and freedom of religion. And then the next time that connection is strengthened a little and then strengthened a little. And literally that ability to think about that thing grows in their brain through repetition, but they're never going to hear it if they don't keep hearing it over and over again. Mm-hmm. But still, there's a lot of people we're not going to reach, but the way you achieved these shifts in public opinion is by attempting these to get people to see things in a different way, and by repeating them and hitting them from a number of different sources and sides until, it might seem completely alien the first time around, but over time, it gets normalized, it sinks in, it starts to make sense. So that's why we have our position and we keep at it. How are we doing? I know we're getting towards the
we
hour.
have only a few minutes left. Maybe what I'd like to say before I throw this to Lisa to let her tell you what else is coming up. We've had a really interesting discussions on this here, and also we had done a small workshop on Saturday, and this issue is bringing out some of the very best questions, analysis, and thoughts on any issue I've heard. The chat, which we will provide for you after this is a gold mine. I'm trying to listen and also look at all of the great stuff going on in the chat. It's really good. So if you have not been watching the chat, you'll get a chance to read that later. And for those of you who are newer or who haven't been to one of these before, we do these workshops. We've been doing them about every 2 weeks. Actually, right about now, we make a little change because the candidates get all kind of mad if we keep people out of the field when they should be door knocking. So we generally transition in the few months before the election to doing some more practical things. And Lisa will name a couple of those, but we do these year round and we plan to continue to do that. We're also going to be working on a number of videos that are shorter that you can use in campaigns and such. And we'll talk more about that later. But again, I'm so impressed with everybody's questions and what's going on in the chat. If our combined intelligence and cleverness that I see here exists all over the democratic world, I see an awful lot of hope in that. And let me and thanks to Antonia for being here. I think you can see that there's great messaging advice coming there. Check out her Substack. We'll send that in the follow-up because it's absolutely excellent on this issue and others. So take a look at that. Lisa, do you want to?
Can I just want to say one last thing? I was not able to read the chat while I was doing this. I really can't. But I'm going to go through it. And what I can do is I'm going to put out a third post. I have one post on the good frames for abortion rights, another one on the bad frames, the things we should avoid. And I'm going to put one out that's just about the question of how we universalize issues. But what I might do is either in the comment section below is I might go in and just answer some of these questions manually in the chat at the bottom or something, but I'll let you know because some things in here that are worth commenting on. So I'd love to just kind of go through it and maybe I can just write the answers to it and
we could send it out in another follow-up email.
Or I could do, or a follow-up, or I could do a Q&A post or something like that. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much stuff here I'd like to address. We can figure out how to do that.
I just want to thank everybody for coming, and it's great to see our regulars, but it's great to see so many new people too. Yeah. And hope you continue to join us on our webinars and just keep up with what we're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Antonia.
Thanks, Antonia.
Again, fabulous.
Having me. Right. Thanks everybody for coming.
See everybody later.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jeanette. connectionslab.org